All right, welcome back to Tragedy and Hope Live. All right, so gonna get into the book now. Still on the new era, 1957 to 1904. The disintegrating superblocks, which is on page 1109. All right, the disintegrating superblocks. The chief consequence of the nuclear stalemate was that it made possible a greatly increased diversity in the world. A mutual cancellation of the strength of the two superpowers made a situation in which states with little or no power were able to play significant roles on the world stage. At the same time, the superpowers were not even in a position to press their desires on the members of their own blocs, and the neutrals could act with growing neutrality or even growing irresponsibility. Examples of such behavior could be seen in France, Pakistan, or Red China among the members of the two blocs, or in the Congo or the Arab states among the neutrals. Accordingly, the next divisions of our subject must be concerned with the disintegration of the superblocks and the growth of neutralism. Latin America, a race between disaster and reform. As time remorselessly moves forward through the second half of the 20th century, a major problem for the United States is the fate of Latin America, that gigantic portion of the Western Hemisphere that is south of the Rio Grande. It is not an area that can continue to be ignored, because it is neither small nor remote, and its problems are both urgent and explosive, yet until 1960 it was ignored. The Latin America that demanded attention in the 1960s was twice the size of the United States, 7.5 million square miles compared to 3.6 million square miles, with a population about 10% larger, 200 million persons compared to our 180 million in 1960. Brazil, which spoke Portuguese rather than Spanish, had almost half the total area, with which more than a third the total population, 75 million in 1960. In 1960, Brazil reached the end of a decade of economic and population expansion, during which its economy was growing at about 7% a year, while its population was growing over 2.5% a year, both close to the fastest rates in the world. The population increase of Asia was about 1.8% a year. Russia and the United States was less, while Europe was only 0.7% a year. Brazil's rate of economic growth fell to about 3% a year after 1960, while its population explosion became worse, apparently trying to catch up with the Brazilian cost of living, which rose 40% in 1961, 50% in 1962, and 70% in 1963. Except for its fantastic price inflation, Brazil's problems were fairly typical of those faced by all of Latin America. These problems might be boiled down to four basic issues. 1. Falling death rates combined with continued high birth rates are producing a population explosion unaccompanied by any comparable increase in the food supply. 2. The social disorganization resulting from such a population increase combined with a flooding of people from rural areas into urban slums is reflected in disruption of family life, spreading crime and immorality, totally inadequate education and other social services, and growing despair. 3. The ideological patterns of Latin America, which were always unconstructive, are being replaced by newer, equally unconstructive but explosively violent doctrines. And 4. There is simultaneously an unnecessary spreading of modern weapons and a growing disequilibrium between the total control of such arms and the disintegrating social structure and the increasing social and political pressures just mentioned. Some of the more obvious consequences of these four problems might be mentioned here. Latin America is not only poverty-ridden, but the distribution of wealth and income is so unequal that the most ostentatious luxury exists for a small group side by side with the most degrading poverty for the overwhelming majority, with a growing but very small group in between. The average yearly per capita income for all of Latin America was about $253 in 1960, ranging from $800 in Venezuela to $95 in Paraguay and $70 in Haiti. The distribution is so unequal, however, that 4/5 of the population of Latin America get about $53 a year, while a mere 100 families own 9/10 of the native-owned wealth of the whole area, and only 30 families own 72% of that wealth. This disequilibrium is seen most clearly in landholding, on which more than half of the population, because of the area's economic backwardness, is dependent. Agrarian reform, land redistribution, which seems attractive to many but is really no solution so long as the peasants lack capital and technical know-how, has been carried out to some extent in a few countries, such as Mexico or Bolivia, but in Latin America generally, landholding is still very unequal. In Brazil, for example, half of all land is owned by 2.6% of landowners, while 22.5% of all land is held by only 0.5% of the owners. In Latin America as a whole, at least 2/3 of the land is owned by 10% of the families. Such inequality attracts a good deal of criticism, especially by North American reformers, but in itself, it would be good and not bad if the wealthy owners felt any desire or obligation to make the land produce more. But the greatest bane of Latin American life, as it is in Spain also, is the self-indulgence of the rich that allows them to waste their large incomes in luxury and extravagance without any feeling of obligation to improve or even utilize fully the resources they control. We shall return in a moment to the disastrous ideological pattern that lie behind this attitude. Almost equally indicative of an unhealthy society is the age distribution within that society and the failure to provide education and health protection. About half of Latin America's population is unproductive and a social burden on the other half because it falls into two groups of the young below 15 years old or the old over 65 years old. This compares with only 26% of the population in these dependent groups in the United States. Such a distribution in a healthy society would require very considerable direction of resources into such social services as education, health protection, and retirement security. All such services in Latin America are painfully inadequate. About 2/3 of Latin Americans are illiterate, and those who may be classified as literate have very inadequate schooling. The average Latin American has less than 2 years of schooling, but, like all averages, this one is misleading, since it covers both Paraguay, where very few children ever get near a school, and Castro's Cuba, where we are told illiteracy has been wiped out and all children of school age up to 15 are supposed to be in school. Leaving out these two countries, we find that in 1961, in 18 other Latin American countries, only 36% of the population had finished 2 years of school, while only 7% had finished primary school, and 1 out of 100 had attended a university. The inadequacy of health protection in Latin America is as startling as the inadequacy of education, but may not, in a wider frame, be so objectionable. For if health were better protected, more people would survive and the problems of scarce food and scarce jobs would have reached the explosive point long ago. Unfortunately, this problem of health and death rates has a very great impact on humanitarian North American observers, with the consequence that a considerable portion of the funds for development provided by the Alliance for Progress since 1961 are aimed at reducing these evils of disease and health. Since this effort is bound to be more successful than the much smaller funds aimed at increasing the food supply, the net consequence of these efforts will be to give Latin America more and hungrier people. As things stood in 1960, infant mortality varied between 20 and 35% in different countries. Even in the Latin American country with the lowest death rate for the first year of life, Uruguay, with 25 deaths per 1,000 births, the rate is 10 times as high as in the United States, 2.6 per 1,000. While in Latin America as a whole, it was 56 per 1,000, rising to about 90 per 1,000 in Guatemala. The expectation of life for a new baby in all Latin America is only 2/3 that in the United States, 44 years compared to 66 years. But in some areas, such as northeast Brazil, men are worn out from malnutrition and disease at age 30. While such conditions may rouse North Americans to outrage or humanitarian sympathy, no solution of Latin America's problems can be found by emotion or sentimentality. These problems of Latin America are not based on lack of anything, but on structural weakness. Solutions will not rest on anything that can be done or for individual people, but on the arrangements of people. Even the greatest evil of that area, the selfish and mistaken outlook of the dominant social groups, cannot be changed by persuading individuals, but must be changed by modifying the patterns of social relationships that are creating such outlooks. The key to salvation in Latin America and much of the rest of the world rests on that word, patterns. Latin America has the resources, the manpower, the capital accumulation, and even perhaps the know-how to provide a viable and progressive society. What it lacks are constructive patterns, patterns of power, of social life, and above all, the outlook that will mobilize its resources in constructive rather than destructive directions. Failure to recognize that Latin America's weaknesses are not based on lack of substance but on lack of constructive patterns is one of the two chief reasons why the future of Latin America looks so discouraging. The other reason is failure to recognize that the chief problem in planning Latin America's future is that of establishing a constructive sequence of priorities. In fact, these two problems, obtaining constructive patterns and obtaining a constructive sequence of priorities, are the keys to salvation of all the underdeveloped and backwards areas of the globe. We might sum this general situation by saying that the salvation of our poor, harassed globe depends on a structure and sequence or on patterns and priorities. Applying these two paradigms to Latin American development, we shall find that the problem of priorities is much easier to solve than the problem of patterns. Obviously, the birth rate must decrease before any vigorous efforts are made to reduce the death rate, or the food supply must be increased faster than the population, and some provisions must be made to provide peasants with capital and know-how before the great landed estates are divided up among them. Equally urgent is the caution that some provisions for capital accumulation and its investment in better methods of production must be made before the present accumulation of excess incomes in the hands of the existing oligarchies is destroyed by redistribution of the incomes of the rich, who could invest it, to the poor, who could only consume it. It should be obvious, but unfortunately is not, that a more productive organization of resources should have priority over any effort to raise standards of living. And it should be equally obvious that Latin America's own resources, including its own capital accumulation and its know how, should be devoted to this effort before the responsibility for Latin American economic development is placed on the resources of North Americans or other outsiders. This last point might be amplified. We hear a great deal about Latin America's need for American capital and American know how, when in fact the need for these is much less than the need for the utilization of Latin America's own capital and know how. The wealth and income of Latin America in absolute quantities is so great, and it is so inequitably controlled and distributed that there is an enormous accumulation of incomes far beyond their consumption needs in the hands of a small percentage of Latin Americans. Much of these excess incomes are wasted, hoarded, or merely used for wasteful competitions and ostentatious social displays. This, as we shall see, is largely due to the deficiencies of Latin American personalities and character. The contrast, from this point of view, between England in the 18th and 19th centuries and Latin America in the 19th and 20th centuries is very instructive. In both cases, there was such a drastic inequity in the distribution of national incomes that the masses of people were in abject poverty and probably getting poorer. But in England, there were groups benefiting from this inequality who eschewed all self-indulgence, luxury, or ostentatious displays of wealth and systematically invested their growing incomes in creating new and more efficient patterns of utilization of resources. This is in sharp contrast to the situation in Latin America, where such excess wealth in the aggregate is much greater than that being accumulated a century or more ago in England, but is very largely wasted and surely not being used to create more productive patterns for utilization of resources, except in rare cases. The solution to this problem is not, as we have said, to redistribute incomes in Latin America, but to change the patterns of character and of personality formation so that excess incomes will be used constructively and not wasted, nor simply redistributed and consumed. Okay. A similar situation exists in regard to foreign exchange. Alternately, our compassion is stirred and our anger aroused by American reformers and Latin agitators at the inequities of colonial character of Latin America's position in the world economy. This simply means that Latin America's exports raw materials, minerals, and agricultural products, generally unprocessed goods, and imports processed manufactured goods. Since the prices of unprocessed goods are generally more competitive and therefore more fluctuating than those of manufactured goods, the so-called terms of trade tend to run either favorably for or very unfavorably against Latin America. In the latter case, which has been generally prevalent for the last few years, the prices Latin America has to pay on the world markets have tended to rise, while the prices that it gets for its own goods have tended to fall. As European economists would say, the blades of the scissors have opened. American farmers who speak of the terms of parity have been suffering the same way in the American domestic market. Now, this is perfectly true. The Latin American economy is largely a colonial one, like Australia, New Zealand, West Africa, or Montana. Montana is a colonial economy? I didn't know that. In fact, in Latin America in recent years, at least half of the value of American aid has been wiped away by the worsening of Latin America's terms of trade, which made it necessary for it to pay more and more foreign monies for its imports at the same time that it got less and less foreign monies for its exports. But the fact remains that this reduction in the supply of foreign exchange available for Latin America's purchase of advanced equipment overseas has been made much worse by the fact that wealthy Latin Americans buy up much of the available supply of such foreign exchange for self-indulgent and non-constructive spending abroad, or simply to hoard their incomes in politically safer areas in New York, London, or Switzerland. Estimates of the total of such Latin American hoards abroad range between $1 billion and $2 billion. The solution to this problem must be found in more responsible, more public-spirited, and more constructive patterns of outlook, of money flows, and of political and social security. A similar solution must be found for some of the social deficiencies of Latin America, such as inadequate education, housing, and social stability, widespread tax evasion by the rich, bribery and corruption in public life, and brutality and selfishness in social life can be reduced and largely eliminated in Latin America by changing patterns in Latin American life and utilization of resources without much need for funds, sermons, or demonstrations from foreigners, at least of all of Americans. This is not an argument for a reduction in American aid or in American concern for Latin America. It is a plea for recognition by all concerned that the problems of Latin America and the possible solutions to these problems rest on questions of structure and sequence and not on questions of resource, wealth, or even know-how. The connections of that last word, know-how, to the whole problem may not be sufficiently clear. We Americans have such pride in our technological achievements that we often seem to feel that we know how to do almost everything. But this know-how really exists on two levels. One is concerned with general attitudes such as objectivity, rationality, recognition of the value of social consensus, and such, while the other level is concerned with technological achievement in any specific situation. The former level has a great deal to contribute to the Latin American situation, while the latter level, the engineering level, so to speak, has much less to contribute to Latin America than most people believe. For example, American agricultural techniques, which are so fantastically successful in the temperate seasonal climate, and well-watered and alluvial soils of North America, are frequently quite unadapted to the tropical, less seasonal climate and semi-arid leach soils of South America. The solution to Latin American problem of food production is not necessarily to apply North American techniques to the problem, but to discover techniques different from our own that will work under Latin American conditions. This situation, applied here to agriculture, is even more true of social and ideological problems. The problem of finding constructive patterns for Latin America is much more difficult than the problem of finding constructive priorities. One reason for this is that the unconstructive patterns that now prevail in Latin America are deeply entrenched as a result of centuries and even millennia of persistent background. In fact, the Latin American patterns that must be changed because today they are leading to social and cultural disruption are not really Latin American in origin or even Iberian for that matter, but are Near Eastern and go back for some of their aspects 2,000 years or more. As a general statement, we might say that the Latin American cultural pattern, including personality patterns and general outlook, is Arabic, while its social pattern is that of Asiatic despotism. The pattern as a whole is so prevalent today, not only in Latin America, but in Spain, Sicily, southern Italy, the Near East, and in various other states of the Mediterranean world, such as Egypt, that we might well call it the Pakistani-Peruvian axis. For convenience of analysis, we shall divide it into Asiatic despotism and the Arabic outlook. We have already indicated that the nature of Asiatic despotism in connection with traditional China, the old Ottoman Empire, and Tsarist Russia. It goes back to the archaic Bronze Age empires, which first appeared in Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and northern China before 1000 BC, Basically, such an Asiatic despotism is a two-class society in which a lower class, consisting of at least 9/10 of the population, supports an upper, ruling class consisting of several interlocking groups. These ruling groups are a governing bureaucracy of scribes and priests associated with army leaders, landlords, and moneylenders. So an oligarchy. Such an upper class accumulated great wealth and wealth as taxes of rents, interest on loans, fees for services, or simply as financial extortions. The social consequences were either progressive or reactionary, depending on whether this accumulated wealth in the possession of the ruling class was invested in more productive utilization of resources or was simply hoarded and wasted. The essential character of such an Asiatic despotism rests on the fact that the ruling class has legal claims on the working masses and possesses the power, from its control of arms and the political structure, to enforce these claims. A modified Asiatic despotism is one aspect of the social structures all along the Pakistani-Peruvian axis. The other aspect of the Pakistani-Peruvian axis rests on its Arabic outlook. The Arabs, like other Semites who emerged from the Arabian deserts at various times to infiltrate the neighboring Asiatic despotic cultures of urban civilizations, were originally nomadic tribal peoples. Their political structure was practically identical with their social structure and was based on blood relations and not on territorial jurisdiction. They were warlike, patriarchal, extremist, violent, intolerant, and xenophobic. Like most tribal peoples, their political structure was totalitarian in the sense that all values, all needs, and all meaningful human experience was contained within the tribe. Persons outside the tribe structure had no value or significance, and there were no obligations or meaning associated in contact with them. In fact, they were hardly regarded as human beings at all. Moreover, within the tribe, social significance became more intense as blood relationships became closer, moving inward from the tribes through the clans to the patriarchal extended family. The sharp contrast between such a point of view and that associated with Christian society as we know it can be seen in the fact that such Semitic tribalism was endogamous, while the rule of Christian marriage is exogamous. The rules, in fact, were directly antithetical, since Arab marriage favors unions of first cousins, while Christian marriage has consistently opposed marriage of first or even second cousins. In traditional Arabic society, any girl was bound to marry her father's brother's son if he and his father wanted her, and she was usually not free to marry someone else until he had rejected her, sometimes after years of waiting. In such traditional Arabic society, the extended family, not the individual, was the basic social unit. All property was controlled by the patriarchal head of such a family, and accordingly, most decisions were in his hands. Control of the marriage of his male descendants was ensured by the fact that a price had to be paid for a bride to her family, and this would require the patriarch's consent. Such a patriarchal family arose from the fact that the marriage was patrilocal, the young couple residing with the groom's father so long as he lived, while he continued to live with the groom's paternal grandfather until the latter's death. Such a death of the head of an extended family freed his sons to become heads of similar extended families that would remain intact, frequently for 3 or more generations, until the head of the family dies in his turn. Within such a family, each male remains subject to the indulgent, if erratic, control of his father, and the indulgent and subservient care of his mother and unmarried sisters, while his wife is under the despotic control of her mother-in-law until her production of sons and the elimination of her elders by death will make her a despot in turn over her daughters-in-law. This Arabic emphasis on the extended family as the basic social reality meant that larger social units came into existence simply by linking a number of related extended families together under the nominal leadership of the patriarch, who, by general consensus, had the best qualities of leadership, dignity, and social prestige. But such unions, being personal and essentially temporary, could be severed at any time. The personal character of such unions and the patriarchal nature of the basic family unit tended to make all political relationships personal and temporary, reflections of the desires or whims of the leader, and not the consequence or reflection of any basic social relationships. This tended to prevent the development of any advanced conception of the state, law, and the community, as achieved, for example, by the once tribal Greeks and Romans. Within the family, rules were personal, patriarchal, and often arbitrary and changeable, arising from the will and often from the whims of the patriarch. This prevented the development of any advanced ideas of reciprocal common interest, whose interrelationships, by establishing a higher social structure, created at the same time rules superior to the individual, rules of an impersonal and permanent character, in which law created authority, and not, as in the Arabic system, authority created law, or at least temporary rules. To this day, the shattered cultures along the whole Pakistani-Peruvian axis have a very weak grasp of the nature of a community or of any obligation to such a community, and regard law and politics as simply personal relationships whose chief justification is the power and position of the individual who issues the orders. The state, as a structure of force, more remote and therefore less personal than the immediate family, is regarded as an alien and exploitative personal system to be avoided and evaded simply because it is more remote, even if of similar character, than the individual's immediate family. This biological and patriarchal character of all significant social relationships in Arab life is reflected in the familiar feature of male dominance. Only the male is important. The female is inferior, even subhuman, and becomes significant only by producing males, the one thing, apparently, that the dominant male cannot do for himself. Because of the strong patriarchal character of Arab marriage, a new wife is not only subjected sexually to her husband, she is also subjected socially and personally to his family, including his brothers, and above all his mother, who has gained this position of domination over other females in the house by having produced male children. Sex is regarded almost solely as a physiological relationship with little emphasis on the religious, emotional, or even social aspects. Love, meaning concern for the personality or developing personalities of the sexual partner, plays little role in the Arabic sexual relationships. The purpose of such relationships in the eyes of the average Arab is to relieve his own sexual desire or to generate sons. Such sons are brought up in an atmosphere of whimsical, arbitrary, personal rules where they are regarded as superior beings by their mother and sister and inevitably by their father and themselves simply on the basis of their maleness. They are spoiled, undisciplined, self-indulgent, and unprincipled. Their whims are commands, their urges are laws. They are exposed to a dual standard of sexual morality in which any female is a legitimate target of their sexual desires, but the girl they marry is expected to be a paragon of chaste virginity. The original basis for this emphasis on the bride's virginity rested on the emphasis on blood descent and was intended to be a guarantee of the paternity of children. The wife, as a child-producing mechanism, had to produce the children of one known genetic line and no other. This emphasis on virginity of any girl who could be regarded as acceptable as a wife was carried to extreme. The loss of a girl's virginity was regarded as an unbearable dishonor by the girl's family, and any girl who brought such dishonor on the family was regarded as worthy of death at the hands of her father and brothers. Once she is married, the right to punish such a transgression is transferred to her husband. To any well-bred girl, her premarital virginity and the reservation of sexual access to her husband's control after marriage, her honor, have pecuniary value. Since she has no value herself as a person apart from her honor and has little value as a worker of any sort, her virginity before marriage has a value in money equal to the expense of keeping her for much of her life, since, indeed, this is exactly what it was worth in money. As a virgin, she could expect the man who obtained her in marriage to regard that asset as equivalent to his reciprocal obligation to support her as a wife. As a matter of fact, her virginity was worth much less than that, for in traditional Arabic society, if she displeased her husband, even if she merely crossed one of his whims, he could set her aside by divorce, a process very easy for him, with little delay or obligation, but impossible to achieve on her part, no matter how eagerly she might desire it. Moreover, once her virginity was gone, she had little value as a wife or a person unless she had mothered a son, and could be passed along from man to man, either in marriage or otherwise, with little social obligation on anyone's part. As a result of such easy divorce, the narrow physiological basis on which sexual relations are based, plus the lack of value of a woman once her virginity is gone, Arab marriage is very fragile, with divorce and broken marriage about twice as frequent as in the United States. Even the production of sons does not ensure the permanence of the marriage, since the sons belong to the father, whatever the cause of the marriage disruption. As a result of these conditions, marriage of several wives in sequence, a phenomenon we associate with Hollywood, is much more typical in the Arab world and is much more frequent than the polygamous marriage, which, while permitted under Islam, is quite rare. That's because you need to have a separate house for each wife. And unless you're super rich, you can't have a separate house for each wife. Not more than 5% of married men in the Near East today have more than one wife at the same time because of the expense, but the number who remain in monogamous union until death is almost equally small. As might be expected in such a society, Arabic boys grow up with the egocentric, self-indulgent, undisciplined, immature, spoiled, subject to waves of emotionalism, whims, passion, and pettiness. The consequence of this for the whole Pakistani-Peruvian axis will be seen in a moment. Another aspect of Arabic society is its scorn of honest, steady manual work, especially agricultural work. This is a consequence of the fusion of at least three ancient influences. First, the archaic bureaucratic structure of Asiatic despotism, in which peasants supported warriors and scribes, regarded manual workers, especially tillers of the soil, as the lowest layer of society, and regarded the acquisition of literacy and military prowess as the chief roads to escape from physical drudgery. Second, the fact that classical antiquity, those whose influences on the subsequent Islamic civilization was very great, was based on slavery, and came to regard agricultural or other manual work as fit for slaves, also contributed to this idea. Third, the Bedouin tradition of pastoral, warlike nomads scorned tillers of the soil as weak and routine persons of no real spirit or character, fit to be conquered or walked on, but not to be respected. The combination of these three formed the lack of respect for manual work that is so characteristic of the Pakistani-Peruvian axis. Somewhat similar to this lack of respect for manual work are a number of other characteristics of traditional Arab life that have also spread the length of the Pakistani Peruvian axis. The chief source of many of these is the Bedouin outlook, which originally reflected the attitudes of a relatively small group of Islamic culture, but which, because they were superior, conquering group, came to be copied by others in the society, even by the despised agricultural workers. These attitudes include lack of respect for the soil, for vegetation, for most animals, and for outsiders. These attitudes, which are singularly ill fitted for the geographic and climatic conditions of the whole Pakistani Peruvian area, are to be seen constantly in everyday life of that area as erosion, destruction of vegetation and wildlife, personal cruelty and callousness to most living things, including one's fellow men, and a general harshness and indifference to God's creation. This final attitude, which well reflects the geographic conditions of the area, which seem to be harsh and indifferent as man himself, is met by those men who must face it in their daily life as resigned submission to fate and to the inhumanity of man to man. Interestingly enough, these attitudes have successfully survived the efforts of the three great religions of ethical monotheism native to the area to change these attitudes. The ethical sides of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam sought to counteract harshness, egocentricity, tribalism, cruelty, scorn of work and of one's fellow creatures, but these efforts on the whole have met with little success throughout the length of the Pakistani Peruvian axis. Of the three, Christianity, possibly because it sets the highest standards of the three, has fallen furthest from achieving its aims. Love, humility, brotherhood, cooperation, the sanctity of work, the fellowship of the community, the image of man as a fellow creature made in the image of God, respect for women as personalities and partners of men, mutual helpmates on the road to spiritual salvation, and the vision of our universe with all its diversity, complexity, and multitude of creatures as a reflection of the power and goodness of God. These basic aspects of Christ's teachings are almost totally lacking throughout the Pakistani Peruvian axis, and most notably absent on the Christian portion of that axis from Sicily or even the Aegean Sea westward to Baja California and Tierra del Fuego. Throughout the whole axis, human actions are not motivated by these Christian virtues, but by the more ancient Arabic personality traits which became vices and sins in the Christian outlook: harshness, envy, lust, greed, selfishness, cruelty, and hatred. Islam, the third in historical sequence of the ethical monotheistic religions of the Near East, was very successful in establishing its monotheism, but had only very moderate success in spreading its version of Jewish and Christian ethics to Arabs. These moderate successes were counterbalanced by other incidental consequences of Muhammad's personal life and of the way in which Islam spread to make the Muslim religion more rigid, absolute, uncompromising, self-centered, and dogmatic. The failure of Christianity in these areas west from Sicily was even greater and was increased by the spread of Arab outlooks and influence to that area, and especially to Spain. The old French proverb, which says that Africa begins at the Pyrenees, does not, of course, mean by Africa that black Africa, which exists south of the deserts, but means the world of the Arab, which spread in the 8th century across Africa from Sinai to Morocco. To this day, the Arab influence is evident in southern Italy, northern Africa, and above all in Spain. It appears in the obvious things, such as architecture, music, the dance, the literature, but most prominently it appears in outlook, attitudes, motivations, and value systems. Spain and Latin America, despite centuries of nominal Christianity, are Arabic areas. No statement is more hateful to Spaniards and Latin Americans than that. But once it is made, and once the evidence on which it is based is examined in an objective way, it becomes almost irrefutable. In Spain, the Arab conquest of 711, which was not finally ejected until 1492, served to spread Arab personality traits in spite of the obvious antagonism between Muslims and Christians. In fact, the antagonism helped to build up those very traits that I have called Arabic: intolerance, self-esteem, hatred, militarization, cruelty, dogmatism, rigidity, harshness, suspicion of outsiders, and the rest of it. The Arab traits that were not engendered by this antagonism were built up by the emulation, the tendency of conquered people to copy their conquerors, no matter how much they profess to hate them, simply because they are a superior social class. From this emulation came the Spanish and Latin American attitudes towards sex, family structure, and child rearing that are distinctive features of Spanish-speaking life today, and that make Spanish-speaking areas so ambiguously part of Western civilization in spite of their nominal allegiance to such an essential Western trait as Christianity. For the West, even as it nominally ceases to be Christian, and most obviously in those areas which have, at least nominally, drifted furthest from Christianity, still has many of the basic Christian traits of love, humility, social concern, humanitarianism, brotherly care, and future preference. However detached these traits may have become from the Christian idea of deity or of individual salvation in a spiritual eternity. In Latin America and the Mediterranean version of Arabized life again found its traits preserved and sometimes reinforced by the historical process. In Latin America, non-Spanish influence, chiefly Indian, Negro, and North American, can be observed in such things as music, dances, superstitions, agricultural crops and diet, largely Indian, or in transportation, communications, and weapons, largely European. But the basic structures of family and social life, of ideological patterns and values are, to this day, largely those of the Arabic and of the Pakistani-Peruvian axis. The Iberian conquest of Latin America, not as an area of settlement, but as an area of exploitation, and the Spanish attitude towards the Indians and Negro slaves as instruments in that exploitative process, the development of plantation colonialism and of mineral extraction, intensified the exploitative, ransacking, extensive attitude towards resources and peoples which the Mediterranean areas had obtained from the Romans and the Saracens. None of these activities became permanent community traits for those involved in them, even for the underlings who operated as part of the exploitative way of life, but remained temporary get-rich-quick methods of mercenary gain for persons who regarded themselves as strangers whose roots were elsewhere or nowhere. The Spanish oligarchy in the colonial period saw its roots in Spain itself, and this attitude, widened somewhat to include Paris, London, the Riviera, or New York, has remained the attitude of the ruling oligarchy after the wars of liberation broke the formal links with Spain or Portugal. In the same way, and for these reasons, the colonial economy and colonialism in financial, educational, cultural, and commercial life has continued after it ceased in the narrowly political sphere. To this day, the characteristics we have listed as Arabic dominate Latin America. No real concern for the soil, the area, for workers, one's fellow men, or the community as a whole. The dominance of family connection and of masculine dominance with its dual standard of sexual morality, its cult of virility, its selfishness, self-indulgence, lack of self-discipline, or of concern for others, and the whole Mediterranean view of politics as a system of exploitative personal relationships of an arbitrary and corrupt character, combining extortion, bribery, tax evasion, and total divorce from community spirit or personal responsibility for the welfare of others or of the nation. This picture of Latin America and its problems will be resented and criticized by many as exaggerated, one-sided, or even as mistaken. Naturally, in view of its brevity, it is oversimplified, as all brief expositions must be, and equally naturally, all its statements do not apply to all groups, all areas, all classes, or all individuals. There are numerous exceptions to large portions of this picture, but they are exceptions and are explicable as such, and there are obvious different degrees of emphasis among various groups, backgrounds, and periods. These are again explicable. Those Latin Americans who are close to the Negro traditions of Africa and of slavery put more emphasis on present preference and sociability than they do on domination, harshness, and cruelty. Again, those Latin Americans who are close to the Indian tradition put more emphasis on resignation to fate and indigenous superstitions than they do on male dominance and proving their sexual virility, called machismo, a key concept in Latin American outlook and behavior. Above all, the scores of millions of Latin Americans who are on a poverty level at or below subsistence have many of the characteristics of a social and psychological disintegration that we associate with extreme poverty everywhere, even in the United States, and are to that degree unable to carry on the traditions of Latin American life, or any traditions. As such, they emphasize, interestingly enough, the traits of male dominance and egocentric selfishness rather than the companion traits in the Arabic tradition of female chastity or family solidarity. In general, we might say that the Latin American tradition we have identified as modified Arabic tradition with Asiatic despotic overtones is more typical of the oligarchic Spanish upper classes than it is of the Negro, Indian, or poverty-racked urban poor. And this is of the greatest significance, for this shows that the means and the methods for the reform of Latin American society rest in the same group of that society. Such reform can come about only when the surpluses that accumulate progressive utilization of that accumulate in the hands of the Latin American oligarchy are used to establish more progressive utilization of Latin American resources. By the word reform, we meant that the power pattern, the economic and social pattern, and the ideological pattern be recognized in more constructive configurations rather than on the destructive patterns in which they now exist. And of these three, the patterns of ideology, that is, of outlook and value systems, are most in need of change. Of course, in any society, it is precisely this pattern of outlook and values that is most difficult to modify. In most societies, this remains unchanged, repeated in slogans, war cries, and religious incantations long after the behavioral structural patterns have changed completely. But in Latin America, there is a ray of hope. A more constructive but ideological pattern is already familiar, at least in words, in Latin America: Christianity. The whole system is full of paradox and contradictions. The real obstacle to progress and hope in Latin America rests in the oligarchy, not so much because it controls the levers of power and wealth, but because it is absorbed in the destructive Latin American ideology. But the real hope is in the area but the real hope in the area rests in the same oligarchy because it controls wealth and power, and also because there is no hope at all unless it changes its ideology. The ideology it could adopt is one that places emphasis on self-discipline, service to others, love, and equality, but these virtues, almost wholly lacking in practice in Latin America, are the very ones that are, in words, embodied in the Christian religion to which the oligarchy of Latin America nominally belongs. In a word, Latin America would be on the road to reform if it practiced what it preached, that is, if it tried to be Christian. Of course, we cannot really say that the solution lies in practice of what one preaches, the Christian virtues, because Latin American religion, like everything else, is largely corrupt and, as a consequence, no longer preaches the Christian virtues. The upper clergy have been generally allied to the oligarchy. The lower clergy are as poverty-stricken and almost as ignorant as their fellow poor in lay society. Moreover, the levels of clergy have come to accept the outlook and the values of the society in which they live. The message of Christ itself, a positive message of action, has been lost in the negative messages of the Catholic clergy reacting within a corrupt society drenched in the non-Christian outlook that dominates the oligarchy as a whole. Only in recent years has there been much change in this situation. In most of Latin America, the Church's failure is recorded in the fact that the great mass of Latin American people, especially those below the level of the oligarchy itself, ignore it or reject it, just as they do in Spain, and especially the dominant males have rejected it, except as a social necessity or an anti-revolutionary force, or as a refuge for their martyr-obsessed women. But the advent of Pope John the 23rd has had a profound influence on the Church by recalling it from its interest and crass power relations to the content of Christ's message. The degree to which this can change the clergy's negative injunctions against adultery, communism, and criminal acts to positive exhortations to acts of social benefit, help, and love is problematical. And even more dubious is the question if it is not going to be too little and too late. This is, indeed, the great question with which all talk of reform in Latin America must end. Is there still time? All right, I'm going to stop reading right there. But it seems like there's a kind of similar problem going on in the United States as in Latin America now, since we've kind of like lost the whole Christian ethics thing too within our political and social systems. And, the rich are definitely hoarding all the resources and, having polygamous relationships like Elon Musk or a lot of these other people. I mean, obviously Bill Gates was doing it too, but he wasn't having a bunch of kids. So, I mean, Donald Trump is kind of in that same camp with the slow motion polygamy thing. And the other part where they were talking about basically like the inefficiency of the system. And now, like a lot of people have been talking about like socialized healthcare and stuff like that. But seeing the system firsthand, like basically on a daily basis, the whole like medical system, there's so many inefficiencies that could simply just be taken away and we don't have to do like a socialism. Like, for example, one big thing is that a lot of doctors still require you to go to the office when you could just do a what do they call it, a telehealth phone call, a live stream, a webcam live stream with your doctor. That would save people having to travel to, I mean, it's ridiculous. They got like handicapped people that have to travel to the doctor's office, sit in the doctor's office, wait for the doctor for an hour. The doctor's moving slow as crap, Then they got to pay for all the staff at the doctor's office to fill out all the forms. They got to pay for this luxurious waiting room so people don't feel like they're in a crappy place, right? So there's a bunch of inefficiencies already built into the system. And then on top of it, now they've switched it to where the insurance companies tell the doctors what treatments you're allowed to get, right? Where before it's like, oh, the doctor says you need this, and then you go to your insurance company and get that thing. Now it's the other way around. Now it's like, oh, the doctor suggests that you might want to get this, and then the insurance company decides what you actually can get, right? And there's just a lot of inefficiencies in the medical system. And yeah, the fact that they limit the amount of doctors that are allowed to be in the system, they do it on purpose. They do it on purpose so that their pay stays high. They could easily make it easier to become a doctor. It's not like you have to be a super genius to be like, for example, like a general practitioner or a pediatrician or even like a foot doctor. I mean, really, I mean, how smart do you have to be to remember what every bone in the foot is and every muscle group in the foot is, right? You don't have to be like Einstein, really, but that's what they make it out to seem like, but it's not really true. So yeah, they definitely could make becoming a doctor easier, especially for like low level stuff. And then again, that would really cut down on wait times too, because if there's more doctors and there's more of like a stratified level of doctors where there's more general practitioners and more people that can do the more basic stuff, then that would free up, the high level doctors, your like neurologist and cardiologist and pulmonary specialist and all those type of people to work on the more serious cases instead of them having to like be in their office and then one person comes in and they're like, I got a cold. It's like, yeah, we'll just go home, drink some fluids and lay down, get a little bit of rest, make sure you eat enough food, whatever, it's like, but you have to wait in the doctor for that person. And then you got like a serious problem, like you broke your hand or like your finger's broken or you got some type of crazy allergies or something like that, right? And you're sitting there waiting for hours, right? I could go on for days on this type of stuff, but there's a lot of, I think, like he's saying here, if they can address the inefficiencies alone, that would free up so much money, so much time that we wouldn't even need to do a socialism. But I can understand why people want to do it, but it's like a slippery slope type of thing because anybody can just claim that, well, hey, I need this thing to survive. Like I could make a pretty robust argument that an organism needs to reproduce to survive, right? And so therefore women are now like I'm require a woman in order to reproduce so that I can stay alive. So am I allowed to like go around and shoot people now because I can't get a girlfriend? Right? It's kind of the same thing. It's like saying like, okay, look, I'm not going to be moral fagging for Luigi Mangione because if he gets off, I don't really care. Because I mean, look at Bill Gates. Bill Gates gets off. It's like, it's clear that all these guys were like doing underage prostitutes. I don't even want to call them prostitutes because you can't become a prostitute when you're underage. So I still consider it like they were kidnapped. Like they were banging kidnapped girls, right? They're getting off scot-free. So if Luigi Mangione gets off scot-free, I'm not going to sit here and pretend like it's a big deal, but I'm just saying in principle, anyone can make an argument that, oh, you have something that I need, and so therefore now I'm allowed to kill you. You see what I'm saying? Like, sure, it's cool, and, sure, the healthcare CEOs suck, but, you see what I'm saying? Like, once it gets to that level where I can just make an argument, a robust argument that I need something to live, like i.e. reproduction, and that women are blocking me from getting my thing to live. And so therefore, should I be allowed to kill people or kidnap people or harm people to get what I define personally as what I need to live? Right? It's just a basic principle that if somebody has something that you need, it doesn't automatically qualify that you're allowed to kill them, because there's tons of stuff that you could quote unquote need, right? Like there's people that have houses, and if you don't have a house, it can be very easy to define needing some place to live as a human need, and then therefore someone can kill someone else because they have a house and you don't, right?
And so that's why I'm saying it's like a slippery slope, right? Okay, that's it. But like I'm saying, I don't really care if he gets off because it's a one-time thing. And obviously, rich people are getting off with way more all the time, like for years and years and years. And then even when the evidence is presented to the public, to the courts, to the FBI, this guy was banging underage girls that were basically kidnapped for years, for years. And he's not even going to see a handcuff or a lawyer, nothing. So if they let Mangione off, good luck to him, right? So that's the video for today. Thanks for watching if you did. If you didn't, you won't hear this part anyway. Otherwise, have a good day and peace.